of media coverage praising and applauding the efforts of the Indian medical fraternity, there have also been a similar amount of pages that have scrutinized and criticized the Indian medical fraternity, and a lot of problems that have been plaguing the Indian medical scene have come to fore. Today's panel discussion, Healthcare in India, aims at answering exactly those burning questions which have been raised. The affordability and accessibility of healthcare, the role of NGOs, the government, and the regulation of the private medical sector. Let us deep dive into the workings of the healthcare industry in India and recent learnings from the COVID 19 pandemic. Once again, welcome. This is the Modern Society, and I am KC Kavirappa, your moderator for today. Now, please allow me to introduce our panel for today. Our panel comprises of our guest speaker, Dr. S. Rama Gokula Krishna, Anada Rathore from second year EMS, Sarah Vinson from second year EMS, Danika Ayappa from first year IES, and Harsh Tejwani from second year IFA. Welcome all. I would now like to call upon Ms. Paradi Keshan to introduce Dr. S. Rama Gokula Krishna, our guest speaker for today.
Good evening, everyone present here. Today we have amongst us Dr. S. Rama Gokula Krishnan, Assistant Professor, Department of Social Work, St. Joseph's College. An alumnus of our very own college who graduated with Bachelor's of Arts HEP in the year 2012 and went on to do his Master's in Social Work. Today, Dr. Krishnan did his PhD from Bharati Dasan University. He was awarded the Junior Research Fellowship for his exemplary performance in UGC NET. Dr. Krishnan has been an active social worker and contributed significantly to many organizations across Bangalore. He has worked on research alongside the National Commission for Women, Government of India. He has studied mental health, gender, and poverty closely. He has also worked extensively with the youth and published over 23 articles in international journals and a book titled Mental Health and Quality of Life of Youth Living in Slums. Dr. Krishnan, we are extremely delighted to have you join in on the discussion and share your thoughts and opinion with us. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the very generous introduction, and really happy to be here. As you rightly said, I'm an alumnus of this college, so I'm really happy. It's like home to me, so it's not something foreign. And I'm a student of economics, just like you all. I did my economics, bachelor's in history, economics, and political science. Economics was my favorite subject, and now I'm a social worker as well. So it's I'm jumping between two fields. But to do I have time to talk now? Can I start talking about it, or do we have some other panelists joining in?
No, so you can please begin. Thank you
Oh,
so much. It's a privilege to have you here and hear your thoughts.
again, thank you. So let me start by first of all, talking about the positives of the healthcare industry, like your host rightly said. I think none of us could have imagined the kind of work that they have done during the pandemic. They've risked their own lives, their own families, and not just their own life, they're also their families. Because remember, today we are confident and we're somewhat having offline classes because we are having vaccines. All of us are vaccinated, all of us are safe to some extent, and we're all wearing masks and all of that. But when the pandemic first broke out, there was no vaccine, and the masks were also questionable. They were saying that whether the mask was really helpful or not. It was a big question. So we've come a long way from there, and we really have to appreciate the first responders, the frontline workers, the doctors who were really putting their heart and soul to saving a lot of lives. So there's definitely that. So this talk is not about criticizing the healthcare industry, criticizing the doctors or the medical professionals or the people who put their lives on the line for us. But rather, this is I want to talk about the business aspect of the healthcare industry and where things can improve. So, as you may know or may not know, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry says that about $372 billion is what the healthcare industry in India is going to be worth. 372 billion. That's billion with a B, and that's how much the healthcare industry is worth in India. And it says that about 0.5 million, that's about 500,000 of jobs are being created by the healthcare industry in India every year. 500,000 jobs, guys. And it also is about to contribute about 3% of India's GDP. Right, so that's how important and powerful the healthcare industries. In fact, it's not yet reached its, I would say that it's not yet reached its full potential, because if you look at a country like America, where, they've already developed, the healthcare industry is even more powerful. There, they call the big healthcare companies are called big pharma, so basically they're the pharmaceutical companies, and they're so powerful that they can even overturn a government, right? So that's how powerful they are. And I have a feeling that the same thing is going to happen to India. And the reason is quite simple. Currently, India has the highest youth population in the world. I don't know how many of you know that India has highest youth population between the ages of 15 to 24 as the UN defines it. We have different definitions of youth, but the UN defines it as 15 to 24. So those who are between 15 to 24, India has the highest population. Now, we have always had this fear that we are going to have a population explosion, and that we are having a population explosion, and then India is going to be overtaking China and all of that. But the statistics and the data suggests otherwise. I don't know how many of you saw the National Family Healthcare Survey, which basically suggests, the Government of India survey, which suggests that the fertility rate of India has dropped. Right? The fertility rate of India has dropped to 2, and that might not sound like a big number. It's still 2 children per woman, and the reason for this is not yet clear. Some doctors and some experts, rather medical experts, and also policy experts suggest that it's because of the improvement in access to contraceptives. But then there's also this other debate, also the other perspective, which is research based. There are a lot of studies done on this, that when you increase female literacy, when you improve female literacy, the number of children, the fertility rate drops, and as a result, the population will become stabilized. So because of the improvement in female literacy, there's no doubt that this has contributed to the reduction in the fertility rate. So what I'm trying to get at is that in a few years from now, we won't have a problem of excessive population. Rather, we'd have a worry that we have too few young people. The young people are going to go down, and the number of middle-aged and older people are going to increase. And why is this a worrying trend? I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but it is something that we need to, because our healthcare industry has to be able to match that. Okay, so when you have a lot of people in the mid 40s or late 40s or 50s or even 60s and 70s, you need the healthcare industry to catch up, right? So America, for example, has a more aging population than us. I mean, they're not like so aging, but definitely older than us. And there's so many other European countries and other developed countries. Even Japan has a huge aging population. So having an aging population puts a lot of stress on the healthcare industry. So with regard to that, the question is our healthcare industry capable of handling that? That is a big question, because as we saw in the recent pandemic, despite the brave and valiant efforts of the what do I say, the healthcare professionals, the system was just not up to the mark to save a lot of people. Millions of people, thousands of people died during the second wave, precisely because the medical facilities just couldn't catch up. The infrastructure just wasn't enough to handle so many cases. And that was the biggest fear we had. It was not that it was not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but rather whether the healthcare industry could hang on to it. So that's one side of the problem, whether India can grow. I have a feeling it can, because as India is a developing country, and I mean it. I don't say it sarcastically. I'm really meaning it when I say that, because of the pandemic, our growth has slowed down a bit, but there's every indication that our economy is going to grow, it's going to improve, and we are definitely going to be one of those countries with a great healthcare system in the future. But until then, we'll have to manage. So that's one thing that we need to talk about. The other bigger issue that I wanted to talk to you about today is about something that I called a medical mafia. Okay, so I have a term that I've developed called medical mafia, and I'll just start with a small anecdote, maybe, so that it's much easier for me to get into the topic when I talk to you about the medical mafia. So what am I saying when I say medical mafia? So one of my friends, was a young person. He recently had a gastric issue, and this gastric issue was really troubling him. He was vomiting and all, and he was one of those people who had a big what do you say, a healthcare like a healthcare insurance or a health insurance. So what this guy did is he said that, okay, I have an insurance and everything will be covered, and the local the generalist, the general practitioner, he couldn't help him with much. So what he said was, okay, let me go to a specialist hospital, one of the best hospitals in Bangalore. I don't want to name the hospital. He went there, and he got himself admitted, thinking that he would get the best treatment and all of that. And he got himself admitted for, like, I think 2 or 3 days when I first visited him. And his situation seemed to be slightly better. I mean, he was able to eat food, and he was able to digest food, and he was okay. He was able to sit and talk and all of that. But even then, he wasn't fully all right. Okay. So then they started doing a lot of tests on him. He had, I think, around 10 or 15 tests being done on him. Yeah. And then they said that no, you need to stay back for a few more days. We need to do more tests, and the results are not yet out, so we can't let you go. So you need to be, with us. And so he stayed there for about a week, and then it was almost 10 days. And then the next time I went to visit him, almost about close to 10 days, around seventh or eighth day, I went there, and he was sitting in the bed. He was definitely better. He was definitely looking better. I don't know what it was. We still don't know what it was, but he was looking better. Maybe it was just good food and a change of environment, what it was. So he was there, and then just in front of me, a doctor walks in, and we were talking about him being released, and the doctor walks in and he says, Mr. So and so, your gas, while doing your various tests, we also had a X-ray, and we looked at your backbone, and it looks like your backbone is sort of, he said he used a technical word, and he said it seems like it's not adjusted, aligned properly, and it seems that there's some problems with the joints or something, and you can see that there's a possibility of the backbone collapsing altogether, and there's a possibility of you ending up in a wheelchair for the rest of your life. He said that right in front of me, and my friend was it was happening live, and I looked at him and I said, and we just exchanged glances. And as soon as the doctor went, we decided, it's time to get out of this place and go back home. And the next day he wheeled himself out, and he took everyone, his family members wheeled him out, and he just escaped from the place. It took him, and the amount of money they charged him. And the insurance company, they're very, very clever. In most cases, they're just looking for a reason to reject your claim. Okay. So what happened is one of the doctors there made a mistake. She ticked one of his conditions as a pre-existing condition. So one of the clauses in the health insurance scheme is that it says that if you have a pre-existing condition, then the healthcare insurance won't cover that. So something like that happened, and the whole claim got rejected, and he couldn't. He had to pay around 2 lakhs from his own pocket. He's not a very wealthy guy. He's a middle class guy. He had saved some money, and he had to pay from that. So almost 2 lakhs. And and even today he doesn't know what went wrong and what set it right. I have a feeling it was just a small stomach infection or something like that, because he was all right after that. I mean, he came home, he was perfectly fine, but he had to, he was what do I say? He was cheated of 2 lakhs from his pocket, and so this is what I call medical mafia. This is what I call medical mafia. And this is not the only case. I'm sure you've had your family members or friends in Bangalore or any of the major cities experience a similar experience, have a similar experience, where you've seen that, the people who are supposed to treat you are charging you a huge amount of money, and you're not getting treated you're not getting treated as well. I don't know what to say about it. So this is what I call as a medical mafia. It's where people are basically cheated of their money, and a huge part of this this is a multi-fold scheme. On the one side you have the insurance companies who don't want to take responsibility, and on the other side you have the hospitals themselves who are who are basically running like a business. It's good to have business. I'm a student of economics. I believe that you need business, you need the private sector, healthcare in the private sector, because the healthcare in the private sector is what does innovation comes from the private sector. Okay, as we all know, students of business economics, that how important innovation is, how important business is for the economy. But I don't think I think there's some areas, as a social worker also, I think there's some areas where we have to be really, really vigilant of the private sector, especially when they deal with people's lives. Okay, the people's lives, they're not objects, they're human beings, and human beings have human rights. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 human rights, right? And we have a right to a good life. So this is a major thing. So as I said, on the one side it's the insurance companies. On the other side we have these big hospitals who are trying to cheat people, and I would say it's not. And again, I will not blame the doctors. I don't want to blame the doctors, because they're just employees. They're just like a typical employee in a company. They're working in a company and they're getting paid for it. In fact, I've heard some cases where another major hospital, which I don't want to name, where a doctor was invited from the UK. He was an Indian who studied abroad, and he did his degree abroad. I think he did it MBBS here and went to do MD there or something. So he did his degree, and he was working there, and he got a very good offer from this hospital in Bangalore. He said, it's not as much as I earn in the UK, no way close, but it's still substantial. It's pretty good. And I have my own family members and my own family settling in Bangalore. Why don't I come back to Bangalore and why don't I, uh, you know, uh, become a doctor here? So he thought of that and he came back. And when he came here for the first few months, I think it was 6 months or 1 year, the contract period, he got a very good salary. He was very happy with it. But then later on, as it went on, I think it was second year or third year, they said to him clearly, look, Mr. Doctor, if you want to have the same package as you were having earlier, then you need to do something more. You need to ensure that you engage in more surgeries, and so they were being paid almost like on a surgery basis, something like that. So he was required to work more even when there was there was no work. Maybe mild cases were being pushed to surgery and things like this, to get the same salary. And I have a feeling that this is a case with a lot of doctors. We don't have statistics on data on this yet, but by the looks of it, it's there. Even my own students who were caught between some of them are from Kerala and some of them from other states. They were here and they were very worried during the second wave. Not because of not just getting COVID. I mean, everyone was afraid of getting COVID, but they were more afraid of getting trapped in a hospital, and they were fearing that what if I join a hospital and they rip off everything I have. So this fear is definitely there, and this is what I call a medical mafia. And I have a feeling that there has to be some kind of a good solution for this. There have to be better laws to ensure that people aren't ripped off. See, the problem is the hospitals and the staff. The hospitals and the management in particular, they have specialized knowledge, right? They know what kind of surgery is needed for whom. They have the specialized knowledge, and the common man doesn't have. And as a result, they make use of this expertise that they have to rip off people's money. And that's what I feel is happening, and that's what I see happening. And this is not just this one person. I've seen so many cases in my own family. There was a case that we almost got ripped off the same way. So I think this is a serious issue. I've even written a small blog post about it about 1.5 or 2 years ago. I think I'll share it in the chat box. This small blog post. It's like half a page. Maybe you can read it and maybe it'll ignite some spark. So as students of economics, I'll just end with this. I think as student of economics, you should look at the business angle of everything. I mean, business is very, very important. The economy is very, very important. But healthcare is a very delicate business. Right? It is a business. It's a very delicate business. It's an area where you need to be conscious and aware of the fact that you're dealing with human beings, live human beings who can be hurt, who can be killed, who can die. So you need to be more concerned about that aspect. And if we have that, I think we can have a good healthcare system, and a healthcare system that really saves people's lives, not tries to take it away in the name of surgery and other things. Okay. So thanks again for inviting, and I hope the panel is open for discussion. And if there's anything else I can add, I'm more than happy to add. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts. I'm sure this actually set the ball rolling for a highly informative discussion. And certain parts of your speech that you covered, especially about the affordability and accessibility of healthcare in the private sector, is a topic that we will be talking about in the discussion. And I'm sure we'll be coming back, we'll be coming back multiple times to your speech regarding this while we cover that topic, because it was very informative. And one of the things that actually echoed with me, and I think many of the participants, is when you actually spoke about how the doctors are not the ones who are directly involved in the medical mafia. They're not the ones who are trying to take all the money out of you. They're actually powerless at the hands of their managers, and they are forced to do that. And I think that's a very, very valuable point that we should all actually take into consideration, because we have this negative perception of doctors, but they are as human as us and as powerless at the hands of their seniors. So thank you so much for your thoughts. We look forward to your further involvement in our discussion as well. Thank you so much for being with us today, sir. We will now begin with our panel discussion. I would like to reintroduce our vibrant panelists for today. First off, we have Anadha Rathore, a second-year EMS student. Then we have Sarah Winson, a second-year EMS student as well. We have Danika Ayappa from first-year EMS, and Harsh Tejwani from second year IFA. So before we begin, I would like to bring to the attention of all the participants here and the audience members, please, if you feel like sharing anything valuable, if you feel like you want to add a point anywhere, please feel free to type it out in the chat box. It will be a very valuable session. It will be a very valuable interaction. If you do want to raise questions at any point, please type your questions in the chat box or feel free to raise your hand. We want this to be more of a discussion with the panelists as well as the participants rather than just the panelists talking. Thank you so much. I look forward to the audience's interaction as well. That being said, let us begin. Anada Rathore, would you like to kick us off by talking a little bit more in detail about the affordability of the medical sector, right? Especially the private healthcare center, right? That's where the problem of affordability comes. So please, could you share with us a little more about the affordability, especially in reference with the private healthcare center and the accessibility? Thank you so much. Anada Rathore, all yours.
Definitely. Firstly, thank you, sir, for such a fascinating and insightful talk. And coincidentally, a lot of what you went over is, I feel like, can be traced back to regulation mainly. And I truly believe, like you said, that it's not the individual doctors that we have an issue with. It's mainly that there are certain pitfalls that we need to be aware of, and that comes from within the system. So this discussion overall about healthcare is something that seems almost pivotal in current times, and not just as we emerge from what can be said was the most trying phase yet of our battle against coronavirus, but also a general need to address opportunities and roadblocks within the healthcare industry. So there are a lot of things that go in our favor. For instance, we have a really beautiful balance of the private and the public sectors. There are certain frameworks that need to be adjusted before we can see either of those sectors reach their maximum potential and effectiveness. But the fact that we have two very robust systems within the healthcare industry is definitely something that goes in our favor. And this time I'll be focusing during this discussion more on the private sector and its affordability and regulation. So the private sector dominates the healthcare industry in India, so much so that between 2017 and 2018, 69.9% of all ailment treatments were carried out by the private sector. And this includes, your charitable trust hospitals, multi-specialty clinics, corporate hospitals, and nursing homes. So it's obviously a very crucial part of the healthcare industry. When we talk about affordability, we see a rather strange contrast in the healthcare system. While we see hospitals and medical systems and universities that are stellar, they're globally recognized examples of progress, innovation, and research, their reach is often limited to just urban areas. In rural areas, the story is extremely different, and we will go further into this as the discussion progresses. But we will currently be looking at other certain areas in affordability where the private sector has room to grow. So this firstly includes a need for better payment systems. For example, at the moment, we see majority of payment mechanisms really just being brought down to just cash payments in full once the treatment is done. Sometimes you have to pay upfront, obviously, before the treatment. And so things like, installments and better plans, they would make people hesitate less before they reach out for treatments. Another thing which Dr. Krishnan very well covered in his talk before this was insurance claims. Now, at one point in 2014, according to the World Bank, only 5% of Indians were actually covered by healthcare insurance policies. It's much better now, and although I couldn't find any solid data that spoke about how much the percentage is, it's definitely a lot more. Well over half of Indians are covered by insurance policy. But this is actually, when we look into it further, it doesn't actually make the system any better. The reason for this is delays in insurance claims. So what happens is when patients want to claim their insurance, there are, lots of ways that companies can divert and not actually end up paying that insurance, despite people paying their premiums, paying everything being in order. And this all can be brought down to a lack of effective regulation. So that is one thing. Then the second, we can talk about how most of it is still not digitalized. You would still have to file a report in paper in most places, and especially in areas that are not as well developed. You would have to wait for their response. And in most cases, especially in emergency cases, you wouldn't have the privilege of being able to wait for a response. And what ends up happening is that a lot of patients end up paying out of pocket, and these out of pocket expenses are not just small expenses like we just heard about. They are massive expenses. And a research conducted by Prinja, Kaur, and Kumar in 2012 found that approximately 25% of hospitalized patients were pushed towards the poverty line just due to the expenses of their treatment. And of course, as you can imagine, many patients have been deterred from seeking care just because of how high these out-of-pocket expenses are. Then we want to talk about regulation, right? Because regulation is where we see that there is a need for development. So we have 3 acts that have been crucial in providing a basic framework for this healthcare in India. And 3 of them include the Consumer Protection Act, which covers a lot more than just healthcare, but that's definitely where a lot of the most strong points come from. Then we have acts like the Medical Council and Nursing Home Act. These have particularly delved into regulating the 3 main areas in healthcare, which include drugs, medical practice, and health facilities. But, however, one main concern, which I feel is particularly pressing, is when it comes to India's more federalist approach to healthcare. So India takes a system, it's not just in healthcare, but because we're talking about healthcare, we'll discuss it just here. It takes an approach where states have an individual autonomy over their spending and resource allocation when it comes to healthcare. And this, in my opinion, further widens the divide between certain states' development and its people's access to healthcare. For example, there was this very promising act that came out around 2010, which was the Clinical Establishment Registration and Regulation Act, and we'll call it the CEA for short. It was introduced by the Union government in 2010, and its main intention was to introduce a uniform system of regulation for all clinical establishments in the country, and also, which is very important, to prescribe a minimum standard of facilities and services provided by them. This, in theory, it sounds wonderful. It seems like exactly what we're looking for. And this was in 2010, right? But the issue is that subsequently it's only been adopted by 11 states and 6 union territories. There was a lot of outrage over this act, and it was met with a lot of resistance from, although it seems like it was met with resistance from healthcare workers. If we actually looked into it, it was the private institutions such as, the medical mafia, as we just heard about. They had a lot of issues with this. So they claimed that this was perceived as a state attempt to control the private healthcare sector. They said that there were already enough existing acts, and this would just increase the bureaucracy and the red tape, which would further on increase their costs. And so a lot of lobbies were made, and this really impeded how effectively it could be implemented. And then we had the Indian Medical Association, which represents practitioners of allopathy in India. They claimed that the private doctors were not ready to deal with this, and mainly their main issue was the fact that it would increase bureaucratic procedures. So they started demanding exceptions for individual practitioner-led clinics and medium-sized institutions. But when we actually looked at the names of the institutions that were really leading this approach, it was actually one of the more bigger. They were the more big, familiar names in hospitals and healthcare industry in India. And just a second. So one thing that you can notice is that before this act, although they said that there was already a lot of bureaucracy and other acts that they had to abide by, most of the acts that came before this act in 2010, they mainly dealt with hospital hygiene, fire safety, and other things that were equally important, but they didn't actually talk about the affordability and accessibility of healthcare. And so this sort of lobby really stopped the effectiveness of this policy. And so we see similar situations in many fields nowadays. But another example of such a case was the KPME policy in Karnataka. So there was the Karnataka Private Medical Establishment, and its framework was actually drawn up with suggestions from the retired Justice Sen Committee. And the key aspects of this act, in essence, were to cap prices of various medical procedures. So, for example, you wouldn't end up paying exorbitant amounts for certain procedures. That was extremely important. And second, they also seek to increase the jail term of doctors in the event of medical negligence. And in theory, this sounds amazing. This is exactly what a good healthcare system should have, these two efforts in particular. But again, we saw massive resistance from private sector clinics and hospitals, and they said that their very survival was on the line, because if there was more risk when doctors were prescribing treatments, especially because of the increased jail time, they said that it would be more knee-jerk reactions and there would be more treatment of just the symptoms rather than the actual issue at hand. And while this is something that this is a very valid point, it just brings to our attention that, we would want to see more discourse between the private and the public sector and the government that makes the regulations, because often we see that sometimes private institutions, they have excuses to get away with having things go the way they've been going for a long time, because sometimes in regulations we see that there are people with actually brilliant ideas that can really put India forward in terms of their healthcare system, but this lack of cooperation between the three sectors, which is the public, private, and the government, that often holds us back in such things. Before I move on to our solution for, one proposed solution for this affordability problem, does anyone want to ask any questions or have any thoughts they'd like to share? Is there anything in the chat box? All right, I guess I'll continue.
Yeah, so I guess you can continue. And towards the end of the session as well, I think time permitting, we will be having a question and answer session. I believe once we get to hear the perspectives of everyone on the panel, it will be much more easier to actually formulate our questions. So I guess we'll continue for now. And as and when questions arise, we will answer them and we will target them.
All right, sure. So one solution that is very frequently proposed to this problem with affordability is a system of a universal health coverage. So it seems in theory to be a solution that would address most of the problems with India's healthcare system at its current state. And so this proposal was brought up with a lot of suggestions from the high-level expert group. And the essence of this approach is that healthcare spending would basically be existing to provide equitable access to healthcare for all Indian citizens. So in practice, this would not have any divide between urban or rural areas, different income groups, different states. It would be a universal package. And another thing is that it would provide the public with preventative rather than reactionary healthcare programs, which is super important, because even if we see the case of the second wave that came and really decimated India's healthcare system for a while, we see that eventually doctors and nurses and the system, it did pick up pace. It did start dealing with the problem. It did fight the virus back into a more manageable state. But the issue is we had lost way too much by the time this happened, and the healthcare workers themselves we lost too many of them. They were working at in stretches and at levels that they were not supposed to be working at. They didn't have the resources or the support that they needed to have. And because of this, I think we can really clearly see why we don't want to have the ability to just react to a really bad situation. We would want to prevent it in the first place. And this act would emphasize the importance of proactive measures rather than just knee-jerk reactions, which eventually eases the burden upon healthcare workers and generally upon the public itself. And under this universal coverage plan, the government would not be the only body that would provide, healthcare access to patients and the public in general, but its minimum the minimum point of this act would be that everybody would receive healthcare. So the patient's autonomy would still be respected, and they would be able to choose as to whether they want to go in for private healthcare or public healthcare. But they would never have to be in a situation where, if they are supposed to turn to public healthcare, that it fails them. This is the basis of this universal healthcare. And we do see now with the Ayushman Bharat Act, which my peer will later go into, some of the most ambitious parts of this universal healthcare coverage can be achieved, even the most idealistic ones, if this is implemented the way it needs to be. So, in conclusion, one of the most important takeaways from this segment, if you were to take away anything, would be that there needs to be an emphasis on universality in regulation. So this whole federalism, where certain states can implement their own versions and certain states can choose not to, then the divide between low income and higher income groups, the middle, which is often just left out in certain conversations, they all need to be accounted for. And I know it sounds very, idealistic, but it's actually very possible if there is coordination between the private sector, public sector, and the people who make policies and decisions. There needs to be cooperation. And that brings me to the end of my discussion.
Thank you, Anada. So I think one of the major takeaways is that there needs to be a more cohesive and more coordinated effort to actually tackle our problems, rather than just one person or one body, rather like the government functions as one single body doing it, or the private sector. Instead, we have to have a three-forked effort from all three of them to actually go forward and do this. And I think that's a very valuable point that we will come back to later on in this discussion. Especially, we will be having questions regarding the lawmaking process, especially regarding why we have states doing it and why not the country as a whole. So thank you, Anada. I guess we will now move on to Sarah Vincent. Would you please like to share your thoughts on the role of the government in the healthcare industry, right? And I think there's a lot to draw on from Anada Rathor's thoughts. So I think we will now go with Sarah Vincent. Thank you.
Hi, so I'll be talking about the complete role of government in the healthcare industry. As you know, Anada just explained beautifully the private sector part of in the healthcare industry. So as we know, the healthcare system has been mostly neglected in India, so which has caused a lot of issues currently because of the COVID situation. And the COVID has challenged the private as well as the public sectors. So because of that, like the private and public sectors had to rethink their status of the healthcare system, which in order to rebuild and reinvest in more of equitable and affordable healthcare infrastructure. And like there were a lot of people who were like suffering, and like there was like an oxygen shortage, and they were in beds in hospital with a massive rise in the COVID cases, and this caused a lot of issues. And the government had taken a lot of things into consideration to improve such situations. And so when we talk about like the budget now first, so like the lot of the government has improved the lot of in the budget allocation. So according to the union budget of 2021 to of 2022, the government has proposed an outlay of rupees 2 lakhs to 23,846 crores for the health and well-being, and this is a big increase of 137% from the previous year. And out of that, rupees 35,000 crore was earmarked for the COVID-19 vaccine, and everyone this time is getting vaccinated, and the vaccines are helping in every way. And the Ministry of Health and the Family Welfare has allocated rupees 71,269 crores, and this also is an increase of 10% over the previous year. So as we can see, a lot of budget is been there for the healthcare, and more focus is going for the healthcare. This is going to help us. And the budget also mentioned in the introduction of the National Commission for Allied Healthcare Professional Bills, along with the soon to be introduced the National Nursing and Midwifery Commission Bill. And this regulatory improvements and institutional restructuring that have been proposed will be hopefully contribute in the improving of the health outcome and enhancing economic growth. As you know, because there's a lot of neglect in the healthcare system, our economic growth is also not happening in a good way. So that's like when we talk about the budget allocation. So as we know, the private sector has during the COVID or even before that did not perform did not perform well in the requirements of the situation of the COVID. And even Dr. Krishnan had mentioned that even before COVID happened, the healthcare system was really bad, and the COVID kind of like caused more issues to it. And certain states had some few policies and like things they had started which kind of helped during the COVID time, and with this and all the other states also could like help in it. Like for example, states of Kerala and Odisha, they had these community-based resources like voluntary groups and elected local authority, which would be used for mass testing, then isolations, and they also creating public awareness, because in India a lot of people like wasn't initially when COVID had started, like they didn't have the people were walking around without masks and they weren't following the rules, and that because of that the COVID the cases had increased. So this caused a lot of problems. So states like so because of so many states also like had to like make sure that everyone followed the rules and stuff. And the government also introduced a lot of healthcare missions which helped in such situations, and even with the healthcare system. So one such mission like that is the Pradhan Mantri Ayushman Bharat Infrastructure Mission. This mission basically it aims to provide a much needed fillip to India's capacity to address the urgent public health issues. So we know that there's a lot of public health issues that is happening in India, and with the help of this mission, and not just this mission, there are like so many other missions that have been implemented which helps in the healthcare system. So basically, in this mission, they have it has been established to have like a surveillance of infectious disease. Like they like if there is any infectious disease, how to control it, and all those kind of situations. This mission basically helps. And this also helps in filling the gaps in the public infrastructure, like to improve the public health infrastructure. Then so this when we talk about the rural health and the urban health, this mission actually provides support for 17,788 rural health and wellness centers. As we know, like in the rural health, it's like it's not in a good condition, and even in urban, but rural areas have are like it's been like suffering more comparatively the urban area. So like the rural and the urban uh, the rural and the urban healthcare situation also has to be handled. And even the government of India is there's a plan of increasing the public health spending to 2.5% of the country's GDP by 2025. And so like because currently the public health spending currently right now is not even 2%. So by 2025 they are planning to make it to like that is 2.5 percent. So I would like to know like if anyone over here is aware of any other healthcare missions they know about that the government has proposed for the healthcare industry. Like if you know, like, can raise your hand and you can like talk about it. Anyone?
I think it would be wonderful for the audience to actually go ahead and share your views on, especially just a little bit more information would make this discussion so much more informative. So I request the participants actually. So please, if you know any other thing, you can actually Google it as a matter of fact and just come up with something right now. It would be wonderful if you could contribute to the discussion. Yes, I see 20 IAF 032. Please go ahead. You can unmute or you can type in the chat box, whichever you're comfortable with.
Yeah. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Hello, hi.
So I have been like recently researching about the Arogya Bhagya scheme. It was introduced in Karnataka to provide free healthcare to the people of the state, where they can go to like any private and government hospital. So, but even though there are such schemes, it does not appear that it's helping people a lot, because the budget allocation is not much towards these schemes. Just making such schemes doesn't help, you know, overcome the pandemic. So, what are your views on it?
Thank you, 20 IFA 032. 20 EMS 42. I'm sure you've heard the question and I'm sure everyone has. So please, if you can. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree that like just because these schemes are being implemented, it is not going to work or not. But this is just the starting steps. Like we need, like it's just being implemented, and it'll take time for such a scheme to like to happen, and like over a period of time it will help the healthcare system. Now that the government and government sectors, private sectors, everyone has given a lot of focus on the healthcare industry, and because of COVID-19 it actually has improved, like to give more interest to the healthcare industry. So it will take time, as India is a developing country, so it will take time for such issues to be erased, and like such problems will be there, but it'll hopefully in the future it will reduce and it will be better. So yeah. So
Thank you, Sarah. You can continue now.
yeah. So anyone else who knows about any other schemes? Are they aware of any other schemes?
Yes, 21 EMS 04.
I just looked it up on the Google, and it says there's a scheme called Indradhanush scheme, I think mission, which focuses mostly on like vaccinating young kids till the age of 12. I don't know the numbers mentioned. They are like 90% of all kids by 2020. I don't know how close they are to achieving it, but yeah, that's what it says. Against 12 very highly contagious diseases or something. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, 21 EMS 04, for sharing your thoughts. I think that has also contributed. And I guess we can continue now.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Like how the government is doing a lot, like is trying to improve in the healthcare industry, as well. Like if you talk about the private healthcare providers, also has initiated like including established clear protocols and pandemic response teams, like as if there are home delivery of medication, mobilization of increase in the capacity of workforce. Then there are beds and equipments and diagnostics in the coordination with the private healthcare providers. So the private and the public sector is kind of helping a lot in the healthcare sector, and there are a lot of NGOs as well which are helping, and that we will know later. So yeah, that's it. So for my part, for the role of government in the healthcare industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing what is your thoughts. So I think what we can take away is that the government is implementing a lot of policies, and it will obviously take some time to do it. But seeing how they've taken COVID so seriously, I'm sure they're going to take efforts to actually implement this in a much more productive and a very successful manner. So thank you. So as Sarah said, we were going to talk about the NGOs now. I actually just want to say something about the NGOs personally. Is these people have actually they've functioned with very little recognition, right? They deserve a lot more appreciation and recognition for all their efforts. I feel like they're very underappreciated, underrated. I think they deserve a lot more actually for functioning as NGOs, for doing all of this without any help whatsoever and almost being completely self-funded. Most of them are actually self-funded and take it upon themselves to do it. So this is to those people. I think Danica, could you please share with us your thoughts on the role of NGOs in the healthcare system in India?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Mr. Ramakrishnan and Kavirappa, for that amazing talk. So, as Kavirappa mentioned that most of these NGOs that we see in India or that are present, they're not given a lot of praise, and they're not given importance, because I think the main reason is that the people around in both urban and rural areas are not quite aware of these NGOs existing. So during these past 2 decades, the government has actively advocated to the fullest recognition that it should be given towards the contribution of NGOs, especially in the health, society, and development. So I'd like to first talk about how the NGOs are spread across India. So as per an official information available from the census, it has been seen that at least there are about 3 million NGOs that are registered with competent authorities in both rural areas and urban areas. And the distribution of these NGOs are quite not equal. It's a 60 to 40 ratio. And we can see why, because of the urban areas being more developed than the rural areas. So, however, there are only about 0.7 million of them that could be physically traced out by the Central Statistics Office that they developed a census during 2007 to 2008. So there are these 5 major states that have the most number of NGOs, that is Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Maharashtra. And these 5 states only account to about 58% of NGOs in India. And the last 3 states that have ranked the lowest with the lowest number of NGOs are Bihar, Manipur, and Chhattisgarh. So we can see that in the healthcare sector, NGOs do play a very, very important role. And we can see in the healthcare sector that at least 92% of these NGOs are from the top 4 states, being Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. So we can say, even though that they are not affiliated with the government or don't have any direct contact with the government, they are still willing to and still have not too much resources, but this limited amount of resources which they're actually making use of for the welfare of the people and not for any profit based motive. So what are the functions of the NGOs in a healthcare system? So I think there are about a few main important functions that they play. First being that they establish institutions, healthcare institutions. So we see that NGOs are having limited resources and not enough funds. They establish quite small and specific institutions with specialized or particular focusing on particular diseases or illnesses. So because of the lack of resources, so they are fulfilling health and social needs, like particular to women's needs, children's needs, or old age needs. And these are usually seen in smaller communities than in larger urban areas. Another point is, I think when you talk about NGOs, people are not fully aware of what they're doing, where they are, where they're situated, and how the people in the rural areas can make use of them. So the NGOs also play a huge role in promoting health rights, that making people aware that they have these rights, that they can make use of it. And like our peers said, like my peers said, they mentioned these schemes, and I think by the government, I think most of them are that it's because they're not being seen or implemented, is because people are not fully aware of having these schemes and resources that they can make use of. So that's why they're lacking in these in the healthcare sector. So another point or a function where NGOs play a big role is preventive health programs. So they have preventive health programs in the sense to, because of the lack of funds, they mostly focus on preventive needs than on curative needs. So basically trying to make people aware of the reproductive system in the health, I mean, rural areas, and how alcoholism or smoking or any such particular disease or illnesses can cause health problems in them. Because as you see in rural areas, people don't have that much of recreational means or entertainment. So all they have is such things like alcohol and etc. So NGOs play a huge role in helping them being aware and preventing them from falling into such dark places. And another point is how the NGOs help in health finance and administration of the rural excuse me of the rural people staying in the area. So they are able to have a data and statistics of how each person is how each person is living, their living conditions, how much nutrition and etc. they are taking in. So some NGOs operate internationally and are concerned with global health issues, and some NGOs in India also play an important role in in providing healthcare at times of emergencies and natural disasters, like how we've seen in during this pandemic, during COVID-19. So I would like to further talk about a few health activities of these NGOs. So a study observed that around 100 organizations, primarily or subsidiarily involved in health activities, has a hospital, like how we spoke about earlier, that they have hospital or institutions that they develop in order to help these people. And so the corresponding figures of outpatient clinics are around 9%, and the healthcare system support services are about 11%. So, and we see that most of their activities of these NGOs are like about 84% are found in outreach activities. As you know, we are all probably familiar with, we've gone from schools, from colleges to outreach activities in with the NGOs, helping the rural people and everything. So most of their activities include outreach activities in the healthcare sector. So, and these outreach activities are they constitute about 88% of subsidiary health NGOs in India. And generating awareness, like I've been saying, is to the targeted population in the major a major subcomponent of the outreach of Indian NGOs. So, right. So, what healthcare services do the NGOs provide? So, like we said, they provide preventive care most commonly, and in most states other than Kerala and Manipur, maximum funds are directed towards preventive care. So in Kerala, maximum funds are spent in curative care, with preventive care being the second highest. While in Manipur, health system supportive services in terms of management and financing dominate other expenses. So when we see NGOs, we see that they are not quite they don't have enough funding, they don't have enough resources. So we see not in all rural areas, but quite a little bigger, like towns or villages, we see that they have labs or they have emergency ERs and etc. But not, and these are just very few cases, such as and there are only few states that actually have these emergency and labs and experimentation laboratories. So they are Karnataka, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Manipur, and Uttarakhand. And so yeah. So now we will talk about the importance of NGOs in India. So India has made rapid progress in socio-economic sphere in the last 7 decades. And we can say that proudly that millions have been brought out of poverty, life expectancy has shot up, and literacy rate has increased humongously, and the healthcare services have there's more access to healthcare sectors. So, however, given the vastness of India, be it demographically or socio-culturally, we are diverse. Millions of people are still bereft of a decent life, like having basic education, basic food, water, clothing, shelter, and these people don't have it still. So we can assume, or we can relate to this as the India's economic progress has not been very uniform in nature. We can also say that there is an economic inequality, and so this is where NGOs play a huge role. So they, excuse me. So their job is to fill in the gaps that have been left by the government and help these marginalized communities. So they undertake various activities from the very basic or very direct needs of people having malnutrition, or enabling people to have more food, water, and clean shelter, to empowering people and making them aware of education, sending them to school, their children, and working, etc. And now we come to, last but not the least, definitely how NGOs, have how NGOs receive these funds and resources to help people. Without, the government does play a tiny role, but not directly, but indirectly in financing a few NGOs. So, so a very common feature of NGOs is that the beneficiaries of their outcomes are often not the payers. So they generate resources from donors, and they deliver outcomes to the targeted beneficiaries. So for NGOs involved in healthcare sector, the framework of resource mobilization can be depicted by the way of fund flows from the primary sources, financial intermediaries, and healthcare providers. So the first source is an external source, meaning it can be foreign, it can be international. So they impact the NGOs by even foreign NGOs help NGOs in India with financing their needs and resources. So their domestic counterparts of international NGOs, through which external funds come to achieve stated objectives, such as dealing with only a particular illness, such as tuberculosis, etc. And funds from international development agencies or donors, which have been routed via government agencies or directly received by NGOs. So this is where the government plays a tiny role in NGOs, for transferring their funds. And then we talk about the direct, not direct, but a slightly direct role of government. So the government gives financial grants or schemes or subsidiaries to NGOs in order to help with their schemes and in order to build their institution and help the people in the backward classes. And so now we come to, like Sir said, and like how Ananda said, how the private sector plays a huge role in the healthcare sector, and they also play a huge role in contributing to NGOs. So the private institutional fund available for NGOs on social development. So NGOs may be able to attract corporate houses to take part in their innovative and development programs. So we can see that most of these, not profits, but most of the shares or money that the business has in these private sectors can be taken towards the NGOs. And most of these huge companies, such as, the tech companies and the big pharma companies, that, like Sir said, are helping these NGOs in order to receive their funds and resources, and mostly in the form of donations, etc. So a huge part can be also dealt with can be also taken into the consideration of the NGOs resources, such as self-financing. So the NGOs do have a certain amount of funds that they are receiving on their own, and these are through individual people like us, like common self financing methods like membership fees, service charges, product sales, and factor income like rentals and dividends. And I think the household also plays an important role in contributing to the NGOs, which directly also contributes to the healthcare sector and to the rural areas where we have these outreach programs. We donate, we go, we donate clothes, food, and etc. And especially we've seen during these pandemic, and we've seen during natural calamities that have been going around because of the rain in India. We've seen that most of the funds that now the NGOs are receiving are from household resources. So these are a few points that I've mentioned about how they are financed and what are the main functions of the NGOs that they play in the health sector. Would anybody like to add anything to this or any information specifically?
So, seeing as there are no questions, I think afterwards we will be having a question and answer session. I think we have one more speaker on our panel. We have one more speaker, Harsh Tejwani. So I think after that we will be having a question and answer session for sure. So please, participants, just get your questions ready. We will be having a question and answer session. Coming back to Danica, I get what I think we even the government sector and the private sector can actually take some learnings from the NGOs who are working with such limited resources and actually impacting so many people in such a positive manner. And I think they truly are the unsung heroes of this war effort against COVID, and they truly are the silent heroes of COVID. And I think they actually deserve a round of applause, like from us, a virtual round of applause and virtual love and lots of hugs. So to them, and also just a few claps, I guess. So if you all want to clap, also please do just clap for them. They do deserve a round of applause. So I hope you all can clap as participants for them. They do deserve it. And some hearts also. Please show them some love. But yes, Danica, thank you so much for your views on the NGOs. I think even the government sector, like I said, should take something from them, working on such limited resources and impacting on such a large scale, where we are actually, and I think we also should be donating to them in some way. And I think we will be coming back to that later. Anyways, thank you so much, Danica. We will now move on to Harsh Tejwani. Harsh, welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for being here. Could you please share with us your thoughts on how adaptable the Indian healthcare system is with foreign systems? Because foreign systems are there are lots of things that we can learn from foreign systems. They're doing something right. They've been able to squash the COVID-19 in manners that we have not been able to. Right? They managed to actually I contain it, if I may. So could you please give us your views on the adaptability? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. I am Harsh, and I'll be discussing India's healthcare system and its foreign adaptability. As we all know, the world suffered through a tough phase in the last 2 years, losing millions of lives, spending time indoors, and special mention for those who lost their lives trying to save others' lives. That is, of course, the frontline workers, especially the healthcare community. When we finally make it out of this miserable virus and this pandemic, it is all because of them. There were some excellent points by my former panelists on the affordability, the role of NGOs and the government in tackling the healthcare system. But I'm going to approach this in a realistic point of view. We all know the catastrophe of the Indian healthcare system during the peak of the COVID-19 wave. There was a deficiency of manpower. WHO suggests that there should be at least an average of 2.5 doctors per 1,000 patients, which is in itself a small number. We had around 0.7 doctors per 1,000. So we can imagine how small a number we are in comparison to the manpower. Lack of infrastructure, of course, India has been struggling from the lack of well-equipped infrastructure for quite a while now. All these things have come to the spotlight only after the sufferings of the pandemic. Forget advanced medical instruments, hygiene in the government hospitals of rural areas is so bad, it could risk the spread of a new virus. Basic requirements like beds were also a problem. Where we were so desperate, we needed to convert schools and educational institutions to restricted quarantine areas and still have a shortage. Okay, coming towards the foreign models of how they handled the healthcare system and how they tackled the COVID pandemic. I'm going to take the example of two countries. One is New Zealand, according to the Lowy Institute, an Australian independent think tank, ranks highest in its resilience towards the pandemic and healthcare in general. New Zealand has an almost entirely public funded healthcare system where most of the finance costs are covered from general taxes. These services include physical health, mental health, long-term care, as well as prescription drugs. National government section sets an annual budgets and benefit package. There are district health boards around 20 which provide healthcare at the lowest levels for a small island nation like New Zealand. People might argue that the population density of India is so high, we can't compare ourselves to a small country like New Zealand. Well, there's the loophole in our thinking. We could learn from New Zealand the benefits of decentralizing the healthcare services such that every citizen in every area, no matter rural or urban, reaches out to the best healthcare system for which there could be a more specific annual budget section for the same. Even we have done a similar system where we divide our system into sub centers, primary healthcare centers, and community health centers, mostly in the rural areas. Before the end of the financial year 2019, we had around 1,54,700 active sub centers, out of which only 7,500 odd were qualified for the bare minimum for a decent center. We need to build a more strict, active, and clean healthcare environment around the country, conduct weekly inspections, bring in more medical personnel, and the New Zealand system could be a vital source. During the pandemic, New Zealand government was quick enough to respond and stopped all the flights from China on 2nd February, whereas we took an extra month for the same. Screening began early as they didn't want to risk the spread of the virus, seeing the situation worsen in China. They stopped all the international flights around early March and dealt best with the pandemic in comparison to the other first world countries. Believe it or not, during the mid-August of this year, one man tested positive for COVID-19, which was their first case in around 6 months. The entire nation was under lockdown for the next 3 days, which is remarkable indeed. We have had several examples in slum areas such as Dharavi, where during the first wave it was at its peak, and even then the quarantine measures took 3 weeks to even get started in such areas. So I'm moving towards the second example. Another excellent healthcare system that we could follow is of Singapore. Singapore healthcare system uses a mixed financing system that includes nationalized life insurance schemes and deductions from the compulsory saving plan, or as we call it, the Central Provident Fund. For working Singaporeans and permanent residents, this is used to reduce the overuse of healthcare facilities. They have a scheme called the MediSave, which is a compulsory medical savings account for all the residents of Singapore, such that it is used for future medical expenses as well as the premiums for the medical insurance policies, with the minimal paperwork, which has always been a problem in our country. There was an early outbreak of a virus in Singapore around 2010, where they had dealt with a shortage of beds and took several measures to be ready for the future and never be in such a situation to face a similar problem again. I guess this is what helped them to, deal with the COVID pandemic so easily. So it's that they made it look so easy. As Singapore is a small country, it was able to pivot quickly to combat COVID-19. The government was quick enough to respond to close its borders, implement mandatory mask wearing and social distancing, and introduce the Trace Together app in March 2020, which people must use to enter stores, hospitals, and even taxis in order to keep track of where someone has been if they should contact the virus. The government also made use of buildings that were standing empty. Exhibition centers were turned into community isolation facilities, and empty hotel rooms were used for stay-at-home notices to quarantine incoming visitors for 2 weeks. My solution to preventing such further calamities in the healthcare system is that we could combine the way New Zealand and Singapore handled the case of the pandemic and healthcare systems. We could provide medical insurances by cutting a part of the central provident fund from the working citizens of the country, such that it reduces the risk of overbearing the expenses. Also, we could decentralize the health board with an increased expenditure from the current 1.5% of the annual GDP to around 3%. 3% is the GDP that the healthcare system contributes towards the annual GDP. It will be fair enough to spend on the same thing with an equal percentage. Thank you. That's all from my part.
Thank you, Harsh, for sharing your views. I think we could take a lot, especially from New Zealand. Just stopping it as soon as it started, comparing to India, where we took our own sweet time, the Indian standard time, as they say. And I think that's something we could learn. So now we will be proceeding to the question and answer session. So participants, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to type them out in the chat box or raise your hand, unmute your mic and ask. And also, if you do want to share your opinion, it doesn't have to be a question. If you want to share your opinion or give us additional insights or information, please feel free to do so. Again, you can type it in the chat box or raise your hands, unmute your mic, and please feel free to share. Okay, so I believe one of the first questions, I think, yes, 21 EMS04, please.
Hi, I have a question for Harsh. Like, I hope not it happens, but suppose the third wave comes in like a week. So what should we, like, as a member of like around 30 people, what should we think the government should do? Should we adopt the New Zealand like what they did and like close all our borders and like have another migrant movement and all that? Or should we, I don't know, like what's your take on it if suppose the third wave comes in a week? What should we do?
So, Harsh, I believe the question is, if there were a third wave to occur, would it be a viable option to close our borders like New Zealand? Or is there another much more viable option? Because if we close our borders, all hell might break loose. So, please, your
And
views.
also the thing they closed, like put on lockdown for 3 days, just like uh, like the case appeared and yeah, the lockdown happened the very next day.
Yeah, that's so. Harsh.
Yeah, so hypothetically, third wave comes and we are stuck in a dilemma again. But we have enough experience from the past two waves as to what we could have done. Increase the expenditure on healthcare facilities, oxygen mask, basic requirements, beds, which is, the most important facility which we were lacking in. Second, what we could do is we could get inspiration from New Zealand, Singapore by implementing insurance scheme. I think insurance schemes would take a lot of time, but the New Zealand thing, where if any area or any street even gets a case of COVID, we could put the street in a lockdowns and start delivering groceries to that areas. Start by urban areas. If in chance the rural areas are tough to begin with, we could start with urban areas. So yeah, these are some of the solutions.
Thank you, Harsh. So I do have a few questions which I've actually come across from people. They sent us messages during the registration, of course. So I think Anada Rathor is one of the perfect people to actually answer this question. So the question is, how are the interests of the marginalized being protected? Are there any dedicated policies for the same? So I'm pretty sure it's self-understood. How are the people from a more poor background? Are there any policies for them? So Anadha Rathur, if you may, please.
Yeah, this is actually a really great question because especially when you have a divide, the marginalized groups are the first ones to be affected. And I'm not particularly aware of any policies that work just in their favor, but I do know I'm trying to get the name of this policy and I will raise my hand when I found it. There is one that works particularly for low income groups, which is where we tend to unfortunately find many of the marginalized communities. So I will get back to you on this one.
Thank you, Anada. I think Sarah will also be willing to contribute since she did a lot of research into the policy making and the policies in India. Sarah, would you like to add anything to Anada's question, to Anada's answer?
Yeah, so since in the rural, the health sector is not comparatively great than the urban. As Anda said, actually, even I'm not aware of much things that have been put into the rural, but they are giving a lot of concentration on the rural. Like a lot of development is there, and it's I read somewhere that by soon, like in few years, like the India will be more urbanized because as like a lot of facilities will be available. So this actually helps in the rural areas as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we're going to take one more question. Um, I think I think Sir might be the perfect person to answer this. Dr. S. Rama, sir, please, if you may. What does, according to you, what does India need to focus on to improve the quality of healthcare that is available to all of us?
Well, that's a complicated question, but I'll try to answer. Well, if you look at healthcare overall, we've been talking about physical healthcare so far, and I think there's a paucity of focus on medical healthcare. Mental healthcare. Mental health is one of the serious issues that we don't talk about here. And in India, there are a lot of people who are suffering from depression, anxiety, stress, and it's poorly documented. Recently, I think NIMHANS, the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, which is located in Bangalore, they conducted a survey, or a nationwide survey, and they found a significant proportion of the Indian population were underdiagnosed when it came to mental health issues. So I would say that apart from physical health, which we are focusing on to some extent, I think there should be greater focus on mental health, and that's one area where we can improve. Because physical health, I mean, you can only do so much. We have little amount of money, and then we are trying to manage with that. But mental health, I think there should be first of all greater awareness by the government with regard to mental health services. By the way, India also has the highest youth suicides in the world, which is very sad to know. The highest number of suicide rate among youth is in India. So I think the focus should be on mental health first. That's one thing. And the second thing I want to focus is on, with regard to the physical health care, there should be greater focus on the primary health centers. So we have primary health centers, but how functional are they? Are they able to deal with all the emergency situations? Just a quick anecdote. I was in a rural camp recently. So as social work students, we take them for rural camps. And I was in a rural camp to a place called Chudahalli, which is located close to, and in Anikal Taluk. So it's quite close from Bangalore. It's not too far away. You can go on like a 1 hour ride from here. And we went there. It was sort of like a forest area, and it's also hill and forest area. So we were living there, and then suddenly one of the students fell ill. She was a girl. She felt really ill, and she couldn't breathe. And the closest hospital from there, we realized, was 12 kilometers, and that was through the elephant corridor, and there were no roads. And luckily, God sent us a car. Someone was there with the car there, and they took them there, and I had to go behind a bike, and it was like a Luckily, we were able to reach the hospital in time and save the student's life. But that is the moment we realize how inaccessible medical healthcare is to the rural people, especially to the primary health care. And I used to ask the people, what do you do about cases when you are pregnant? Let's say you are pregnant and suddenly want to go to the hospital. What do you do there? They said that it's all God's grace. If you're able to reach on time, and if somebody is willing to take you from the village to the hospital, then well and good, or else it's a home delivery. So it's very, very sad. And some people, and sometimes the doctors do come to the hospital, to the village, but it's on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis. Very rarely, it's not a regular thing. And for emergency, there's no way out. So these are the two areas I would say we need to focus on if you want to talk about improving healthcare. One is, which is undervalued, which is mental health, especially among the youth in the urban areas. A lot of people living in hostels, not without any support of their families, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, many were trapped in hospital or hostels. It's a very, very, very painful place to be in. And the second one is the primary health center and access to healthcare for the rural people. These are the two areas I would say we need to focus on.
That's true, sir. I think especially the fact that you have to travel to an elephant corridor or dwelling site is very dangerous as well. And especially considering as a village, there might be many rumors regarding traveling in a jungle at night, right? Which is something that there must be, there's ghosts, and so that, and I think what you're saying is very true. It needs to be much more accessible, and also about mental health. It's something that we as an Indian population should focus on. Thank you so much, sir. I think we'll take one last question, and that question is from 20 EMS05. Please, your hand is raised.
Actually, it's Anida, and I have a little answer for the question that I received earlier.
Please.
So the Ayushman Bharat scheme actually aims to provide public health insurance and just free access to health insurance coverage for low-income earners in the country. So this is what I was talking about earlier. And the bottom 50% of the population actually qualifies for this scheme. Then the National Health Policy, which came out in 2017, that one aims to provide the universal the universal health coverage that I talked about extensively during my segment, and that would aim to provide equal health care to all sections of society. But I do feel that if you avoid actually addressing the fact that there are marginal communities that do need extra help, it does make it very wishy-washy, and you don't really have actual action, effective and efficient action taking place. So I feel like your question is very good, and it should be asked at wider platforms for sure, because I don't think this is enough.
Thank you, Anada, for your insights. To everyone present here, we will be concluding soon, and as we conclude, I would just like to call upon Dr. Rama Gokula Krishnan sir again, just to give us some closing remarks and any insights that he has on the discussion. Sir, the stage is yours.
Yes, so I think it was a very wonderful discussion. And first of all, again, I'd like to thank each and everyone who was present here. It's an insightful session because it gives us not just statistics with regard to the healthcare services, but it also shows us, where are the areas where we can improve as a country when it comes to healthcare services and access to healthcare services. We talked about so many schemes. Some of them highlighted a very useful schemes. I hope that people note this down and see, at the end of the day, what we can do as students. Now, we may say, sir, these are all big issues, right? These are issues that we cannot tackle directly as students. But one thing you can do is awareness, right? If you are living in a village, or if you do live in a village, or if you go for a village visit, maybe you're going for as part of your what is that called? Your camp. You have another camp, I believe. I forgot the name of that. Outreach. You have an outreach camp. So when you go there, and you're meeting people in the village, try and educate them, try to inform them. See, these are the healthcare schemes that are available to you. Why don't you make use of it? When we went to the village again, many of them didn't have PAN card. Many of them don't have Aadhaar card. They don't know the schemes. So all of the things that we are discussing, it has to be put into place. It has to be implemented practically. And for that, you need to inform the people in the village, especially in the rural areas. We may believe that we're becoming urban. We are urban. It's estimated that almost we'll soon become 50-50 in terms of rural and urban. But people still live in rural areas. India still lives in villages. Majority of the people are still living in villages. So we cannot forget them. And whenever we have an opportunity, let's go and inform the people. Let's spread awareness on this. And I really appreciate the organizers for organizing this so wonderfully, and for all the participants for patiently listening. I'll also like to thank all the panelists who did a wonderful job of highlighting all the different aspects, be it government health service or private health service and NGOs. And so thank you once again. And I hope this session was enlightening for all of you. And I hope that we can actually make a difference by spreading awareness on this. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir, for your insights. Could we please have a round of applause for all our panelists today? They did a wonderful job, and this was a very informative discussion. So could we please have a round of applause for all our panelists? Thank you so much. Before we conclude and proceed to the vote of thanks, I would just like to request all the panelists, all the faculty members, all the core committee members as well, and even the audience to please turn on your cameras for a group picture. And yeah, please. Thank you, everyone. I think that was it. Thank you so much for turning on your cameras. I would now like to call upon Anushri Pai Raikar, Head of the Modern Society Economics Forum, to deliver the vote of thanks.
It's my honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks and acknowledge the effort of all those who contributed to put together today's event. I, Anushri Pairaikar, on the behalf of the Economics Forum and the Department of Economics, St. Joseph College, would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to Almighty God for making this event a success. I would like to extend my warm regards and gratitude to Dr. Rama Gokula Krishna for taking his time to join us today and sharing his valuable thoughts with us present here. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Dean of School of Humanities, Dr. Clement D'Souza, Dean of School of Humanities, Ms. Anita Narono, Head of Department of Economics, Mr. Keshav Murthy, Coordinator of the Economics Forum, and all the faculty members of the department. Big thanks to our panel members for making today's event a grand success and making the discussion so engaging and insightful. Thank you, Casey, for conducting the event so efficiently. I would like to give thanks to the members of the core committee of the Economics Forum for their support at each step. Lastly, but most importantly, I would like to thank all of you to join us today and for your enthusiasm and participation and making today's event all the more special. Thank you to one and all.
And that brings us to the end of yet another eventful day and a wonderful event by the Economics Forum, Head of the Modern Society. Before we conclude and before we formally end this meeting, I would like to bring to the attention of all participants a feedback form that has been posted on the chat box right about now. Please take some time out of your schedule to just fill up that form so we get some insight into how we can improve and how we can better our event for next time. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a great evening. And God bless. See you next time.